Okay, hi guys, welcome to the session on World Wide Web. If I could have all the presenters come and sit on their throne, maybe we can start the presentation. So, my name is Jillet. I'm the presider for this session. My work deals with how can we use the new media to organize on the basis of class. We also have here with us today Samson, who will be the hashtag moderator. Sorry, my terminology is a little old-fashioned. Alice works on new media technology, particularly for focusing on infrastructure, specifically in West Africa. We also have 4 presenters with us today over here, and we pretty much be moving in the order in which their names are listed on the program. So we have David Peter Simon, Jason Ng, Tolu, Odumosu, and Dalia Austin. So what I've asked them to do is to go with a roughly 12-minute presentation, and we can go with all the presentations first and then move on to your questions. So first up is David. Let me give you a quick introduction to him. He's an ethnographer and blogger from California and is now based in London. He works as an experienced designer at ThoughtWorks, a global software company. He's currently working in Istanbul and has just returned from living in Kampala and Johannesburg, where he's been consulting with a range of companies, including profit as well as non-profit organizations. And he will be presenting on a paper called the Do-Good Industrial Complex.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you, Jillet. So I guess we can get started. Before we begin, maybe I can ask you guys, how many of you guys know what we mean when we say experience designer? I know that's like the most vague term in the world. Did I get like a number of hands? Okay, so I can also kind of simplify it as just saying that I'm a design researcher primarily, but I also do stuff like product management. And today I'd like to talk about a work in progress paper. It's kind of tentatively titled the Do-Good Industrial Complex. And it really revolves around how Silicon Valley's work possibly subjugates the same people they aim to help. And for the focus of today's presentation, I'd like to think really around and revolve around one question, which is how does Silicon Valley control the technology conversation in places like Sub-Saharan Africa specifically? And I'd like to use 2 examples. One is sort of the new connectivity schemes we're hearing about, and the other are hackathons. But before we begin, I'd like to start by thinking a little and framing this from a perspective of Marshall McLuhan. And you know, what McLuhan would like to say is that whenever speed up has occurred, the new centralist power always takes action to homogenize as many marginal areas and peoples as possible. And you know, I think that today we can start to see Silicon Valley as the new sort of centralist power, or at least that's how I've started to think about it. And the reason I think about that is how the sort of transnationalism of Silicon Valley, and that how today Silicon Valley ceases to become a purely geographical location or identification, and it comes to stand for a sort of new terrain of politics. I guess it would be really important to know, of course, though, that I am a member of that sort of movement and group, so it's difficult for me to be wholly objective or critical when looking at this because I need to situate myself within that sort of global community, the software development community. And I come from a global business, actually, that is a group of consultants. I work for a company called ThoughtWorks, and ThoughtWorks has a sort of social mission, which at the heart of our work is to, we believe technology has a liberating capacity for humanity. But at the same time, I don't think we can separate ourselves from the politics or the community of software development, and because of that privilege, that whenever we work with that privilege and its related blindness means that we might also marginalize the people we work with, so we need to be critical about our practice. So to get into the sort of first 2 examples, what I'd like to start by talking about is something that I read by Tim Wu. Tim Wu says, how do we look at today as different than the days of the past? And how do we think about, today the technology revolution as being different than the industrial revolution and sort of the colonialist days of the past? So I'd like to begin by trying to situate that in relation to Silicon Valley and sort of its exploitations in relation to Marx. And so the first thing I'd like to talk about is this sort of internet.org initiative by Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. And you know, this, right now 2/3 of the whole world's population is not yet connected to the internet. And you know, so the sort of, some of these initiatives, the connectivity schemes like internet.org, are obviously very ambitious and they're fantastic initiatives to bring internet to rural populations and areas. But what we have to understand, I think, or what I've been thinking about is, you know, that they obviously, and through my conversations with people, they obviously have a stake in the success of places like sort of quote-unquote Africa and it working, you know, and as some have said, for all the right reasons. But we have to then beg and ask the sort of classic Marxist question, which is, who does it really serve? And what is the real meaning of that? And I think for me, I started when I was reading a lot of the press releases and some of the literature around this, but specifically some of the words that were coming out from the companies like Facebook is the sort of deep capitalist underpinnings of them. And when we see Mark Zuckerberg talking about why internet.org needs to be there, for example, I think that, you know, they're starting to dictate how the solution ought to be for that sense of that other peoples, and it becomes sort of a sympathy project. And what, you know, when we relate that to some of the other projects that are going on, some of the other local projects, you know, in the media and in Silicon Valley's sort of wider discourse, we're not looking towards local solutions. This is, for example, BRIC, which is another one of the sort of connectivity projects looking to connect people in rural and sub-Saharan Africa. And this one is by a Nairobi-based company. And so the sort of grander projects like internet.org and the Silicon Valley ones, they come across as sort of deeply solutionist without possibly understanding some of the troubles that are actually down on the ground. And so Silicon Valley here becomes sort of self-serving and PR building, a sort of cycle for itself. And I think that comes across as a bit paternalistic to the local populations, and definitely in my conversations with local technologists, it sort of is, in my eyes, an attempt to control that conversation. And you know, that's not necessarily 100% bad, but we do necessarily need to relate it to how Africa is still viewed from the post-colonial lens of poverty and famine, which I think is, you know, really upsetting and unfortunate, because that's why there's more sort of aid and sympathy projects than, say, VC money being brought in, or looking at the localized solutions that are down on the ground. And also, when we look at the Silicon Valley press and how sort of what's being related back in Silicon Valley, we're talking only about Silicon Valley's solutions in the media, like Wired. We don't talk about how China brings in the cheapest routers, or China has like brought in the cheapest smartphones. So it's really interesting to think about how Silicon Valley both has the solutions and drives it from that perspective, and also has the media around that. And I guess this brings to mind a sort of tweet I had seen a few months ago that made me start thinking about this, because I was working there as an expat, not an expat founder, but you know, and thinking about how solutions, in their definition, are often the correct answer to a problem. You know, and that's what a lot of Silicon Valley brings in, is solutions. But people locally have answers to things, and they might not be the correct ones, but they have the local ones. And so I guess that leads me to my next point, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking so fast. I had a lot of espresso. But this leads me to my next point, revolving around how Silicon Valley maybe participates in local ecosystems, and sort of what their active role is in engaging the local community. And so that is about hackathons and the role of hackathons in places like Kampala and Nairobi. Hackathons are a really big thing. Hackathons are sort of an opportunity to collaborate intensively on a project, usually intended for sort of educational purposes. It's a way to involve local technologists in the ecosystem. But again, that would sort of lead and beg the sort of classic Marxist question of who do those hackathons really serve? But it also brought to mind something that Richard Saul Wurman, who's an information theorist, he talks a little about how today, you know, back in the age of the industry, you know, that sort of natural resources were the sort of how the world was ruled, but today it's ruled by information. And the currency is information. And so if we think about information as the sort of current capital, then these hackathons and these intents to bring in a certain controlled type of information is, to me, a new form of trying to control that conversation or that form of hegemony. And you know, for example, this is a photo of a Microsoft app somewhere in rural sub-Saharan Africa. And you think about, like, so there are a lot of Microsoft hackathons, but I was talking to a colleague of mine from our local Kampala office, and what she was saying, you know, is really if local developers were building apps for their own business needs or for the majority of the population, that there are actually very few Ugandans using Windows phones. They maybe can't afford them because they may be a little bit more expensive. So Microsoft coming in and bringing hackathons, while they're a fantastic initiative to engage the local population, who are they really serving, and how does that responsibly engage the local ecosystem, and how does it influence the local ecosystem when building local developer capacity is about building enthusiast communities around a certain type of product or a certain type of system. And that becomes, to me, part and parcel of the politics of how these companies engage with the local community. And for me, my sort of theoretical underpinning when I'm thinking about this work in progress paper is Antonio Gramsci, and sort of taking a Gramsci lens at that. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian philosopher from the early 1900s who was in prison for some of his communist and anarchist thinking by the fascists. And I think what Gramsci would say for him is, politics for him is where forces and relations in the economy and in culture have to be actively worked on and produced to create those new forms of power and to create forms of domination. And that was actually a sort of quote from Stuart Hall, who's a cultural theorist. And what Stuart Hall would say is that the reason perhaps Gramsci would be a good way to look at this is because, while Gramsci gives us, not the answers, but the tools with which to approach the puzzle, not solve the puzzle, but to ask the right kind of questions, because what Gramsci does is point us to what is specific and different about this moment today. And so for me, that key takeaway is that it is different. It's not the same exact thing. It's sort of like a new form of colonialism. I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that we need to be highly critical and that we need to reflect more on the role of privilege and the way that Silicon Valley culture comes in and engages with local populations, local communities, and how their solutions might influence the ecosystem. And while I don't necessarily have an answer, it's something, a challenge that I'd like to address in my paper. It's something I'd look forward to talking about and getting different perspectives on. And I think what I would end with is that, for me, I was speaking with Eric Hirschman, who is the founder of the iHub, and we were talking about sort of these conversations, and he brought up a really good point, which is, that it's easy to always make a statement about things going on in maybe Sub-Saharan Africa and generalize it, because it's easy for the narrative, that single narrative. But I think that it's much more different for each tech ecosystem, and that, there are pros and cons to the way that the West has approached technology. But that at the end of the day, technology is different and can drive a lot of positive change. So that's kind of a nutshell of what I'm looking at with the do-gooder industrial complex, and I thank you guys for bearing with me.
Thanks, David, for a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering how much I'm looking forward to some kind of interaction.
Everybody begun to do so. But one of the really neat things about Chinese online encyclopedias is that you can not only do traditional testing, but you also do these sort of quasi-experiments due to the fact that, unlike here in the US, where Wikipedia is the only major online encyclopedia, in China you have multiple ones. So of course we have the Chinese language version of Wikipedia where sensitive content and topics flourish. We take for granted that Wikipedia does not intentionally censor the content on its website, and thus it serves as a sort of baseline for comparing with the two much more popular online encyclopedias in China, Hudong Baike and Baidu Baike. And in fact, Hudong and Baidu Baike are much more popular than the Chinese language version of Wikipedia. Baidu and Hudong's dominance can be credited to the fact that they've leveraged competitive advantages and built sites that mainland Chinese users actually prefer more. Wikipedia China is instead mostly edited and viewed by users from Taiwan and Hong Kong. So this project began with a question. Everyone knows that Hudong and Baidu, like all Chinese websites, have to restrict certain kinds of content. But is it possible to empirically prove that censorship is taking place on their sites? If so, we'd have to think about how we'd even look for indicators of censorship in the first place. The most obvious would be the lack of notable articles and topics that we know for sure are important. For example, here with the article for the June 4th incident, which exists on Wikipedia China, but not on the other two. Second might be by identifying articles that are much shorter in Chinese Baike than on their counterparts on Wikipedia China. For example, the Wikipedia article for incest is over 18,000 characters long, while on Baidu it's only 212. Third, some especially sensitive or controversial articles are unable to be edited except by users with much higher privileges than ordinary members. Being unable to change an article is not in and of itself a sign of censorship. For instance, Wikipedia protects articles to prevent vandalism. Baidu and Hudong no doubt have similar intentions as well, but our question here is whether there was an open discussion about whether something should be protected, as is typically the case on Wikipedia. Or was it the case that someone actually just stepped in and shut it down unilaterally? Again, what started as an attempt to find clear-cut instances of censorship is starting to get murkier. So for the purpose of this project, I made a first pass of trying to identify potential censorship by looking at 3 indicators. If the Wikipedia article didn't exist on either Baike, a Chinese article is much shorter than its Wikipedia counterpart, or an article is locked. As for who might be responsible for these issues, we should keep in mind that there are numerous possible reasons. Judging whether or not these factors are actually instances of top-down censorship or due to explainable organic reasons can be quite tricky. Because of the multiple layers of oversight, what may appear to be outright censorship may actually just be a lack of relative interest, or perhaps a case of self-censorship. Or perhaps in the early stage of my project, it might just be a failure of my data collection. So anyway, so doing this sort of experiment required me to match up articles across these 3 encyclopedias. I automated the process by writing a simple script which took various keywords and ran them in all 3 services, extracting and comparing the pages returned from each. As for what keywords to use in this initial test, I chose a short list of what I thought were relevant keywords. The first 3 here contain keywords that allow us to test for how each of the Chinese encyclopedias would handle sensitive topics. I added to that 2 other categories covering a broad base of both popular and topical issues according to Wikipedia China. And there's some overlap in the list. In the end, I had 5144 distinct keywords, and roughly, when I ran the test, 2/3 successfully matched to a corresponding article on either of the Baike. So I gathered all sorts of data from each of the 3 encyclopedias, and from Hudong and Baidu's pages, I was also able to capture the number of likes and number of edits to each page, which are interesting metrics which I'll talk about in a moment. Anyway, so now the fun stuff. So here's a list of Wikipedia articles that don't exist on either Baike. Of course, we have to keep in mind that some of the missing articles may be due to enforced censorship. Others may simply indicate a lack of interest on the part of mainland Chinese users. We're the primary creators, like I said, primary creators of content on Hudong and Baidu Baike. So in that context, it's not surprising that a small Hong Kong bookstore may not have an entry on either Baike. However, the absence of articles on Falun Gong and Charter 08, even if they are topics of daily discussion amongst most Chinese internet users, clearly indicates that there's a intentional effort to restrict certain kinds of sensitive topics from the site. Again, not surprising. This is going back to the table of articles that are much longer on Wikipedia than on Baidu or Hudong. And actually, if you go through these one at a time, some of them would actually be reclassified into the first category of non-existent articles. For instance, the one on tour on Baidu is actually just a dictionary entry for the English phrase terms of reference, while on Hudong it's about tank. So in actuality, an article about Tor, the software, doesn't exist on either Hudong or Baidu Baike. Though if you look at the version history for the TOR article, it may very well have included information about Tor, about how to use Tor to beat censorship in the past. That is before it was actually censored itself. But anyway, going back to the topic of the topics on the chart, it appears that this list isn't purely random. It's filled with sensitive topics, and thus we can assume that some form of regulation appears to be in force. For example, it's not surprising that the Wikipedia article for the Masanjia forced labor camp was roughly 25 times longer than on its China-based counterparts as of last August. What's more interesting to me is that an article about this labor camp exists at all, that someone contributed to this article. And that is accessible to mainlanders despite the fact that it's an obviously sensitive topic. Interestingly enough, I went back to check on the article last month to see what had been written in it. And both China-based articles are actually longer than they were when I first gathered the data last summer. In fact, the Hudong one is now over 4,000 characters long, with specific sections detailing the types of torture that are alleged to have taken place there. By contrast, the Baidu entry now stands at 1,200 characters, and it also mentions that torture has been alleged at the camp. But the bulk of the entry is about the investigation that refuted those claims, and how conditions at the camp were actually of acceptable quality, and that media shouldn't fall into the trap of spreading falsehoods. So again, we see the fluidity of the boundaries of acceptable discourse shifting, this time with different results from different sites. We can't simply push a pat narrative about authorities winning or netizens successfully fighting the censors. It's not a zero-sum game of that sort, but rather it's a process. Instead of thinking about it as a battle over free speech or a cat and mouse game, both of which are true to a certain extent, I think the better metaphor might be to think of the camps as engaging in a dialogue, with information about certain topics like a female labor camp being negotiated on. And even then, we shouldn't feel comfortable generalizing netizens, or even authorities as its block, when in fact they're composed of numerous groups with different motivations. Anyway, the third of our censorship indicators that I mentioned, protected articles. Here's the breakdown. 5144 keywords tested. Baidu had 403 protected articles, nearly twice as many as Hudong. But if you look at the large overlap of protected articles between Hudong and Baidu, it's apparent that the distribution isn't purely random. Here's a sampling of the list of articles protected on Wikipedia, which, unlike the two Baike, is publicly available and posted to their site. These are Baidu's protected pages. Again, this is just a sampling. Again, most of the data that was collected fits with what we'd expect based on our past work with sensitive topics on Chinese websites. And finally, Hudong. Of note is the sensitive topics that do exist on these Chinese Baike. For instance, children of high-ranking officials, which is really fascinating. These are children who are becoming incredibly wealthy through their family connections. The Hudong article doesn't name names, that might be crossing the line, but it does note that the negative effect on society. So it's not like all critical information has been wiped clean from the Chinese internet. It's just that it's being managed in ways that aren't totally transparent. There exists this in-between space where the topic is clearly sensitive, but netizens have the capacity to perhaps push up against the boundaries, like what took place in the Masanjia prison camp article, or this Baidu article on political prisoners. This article is not only a brief stub that speaks, this article is only a brief stub that speaks in generalities, with no names or links to lists of political prisoners around the world. But the fact that it's been viewed 54,000 plus times, this despite the fact the article is only 300 some characters long, means that folks are actively seeking out this content, and some are even liking it. And indeed, before I close, I'd like to dwell a bit on the likes each article has, which is one of the variables I mentioned that I was able to collect for this project. In case you're curious, the most liked articles as of last August on Baidu are mostly pop stars, Jay Chou, Michael Jackson, Jackie Wu, and that other famed Chinese Lothario, the great helmsman himself, Mao Zedong, with over 249,000 thumbs ups. Though all of them were blown out of the water by the South Korean pop group 2NE1, whose Baidu Baike article was liked nearly 2 million times. So what are users trying to say when they mark something as helpful by thumbsing it up on each Baike service? For instance, what can we conclude from the fact that more people have classified disgraced politician Walsh Li's article as helpful than they have for President Xi Jinping's? Or that 320 citizens liked the Baidu Baike entry on the Masanjia prison camp, the one which refuted that any torture took place. Are these folks patriots who support the government's position? Or do these likes signal the endorsement of topics' existence, even if the content is drastically different from what they may actually believe in? I tend to think it's the latter, and I certainly don't think we should look down on this sort of less active online engagement, what some might consider a kind of slacktivism, especially considering that more active types of support for the wrong cause could land a user in trouble. So these sorts of interactions may be one of the few ways users can safely engage in issues which are typically locked down or censored. So by looking not only at what content and data doesn't exist on Baike, but also the content and indicators that do, we can think about what kinds of knowledge and information is fit for public display. If articles are shorter on Hudong and Baidu, what information do they carry? Does this information reveal anything about the author's intentions? By examining the topics and articles that are left visible, and considering the motivations behind those who view, edit, and approve of these articles, we can seek a more nuanced view of the typical narratives about censorship in China, trying to understand what sorts of expressions netizens are making via these online encyclopedias, despite whatever restrictions are placed on them, is as interesting as studying the censorship itself. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Tolu Odumosu, who's currently an assistant professor of science, technology, and society in the Department of Engineering and Society in Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Virginia, and he's also a research associate at Harvard.
And I'm looking forward to the conversation afterwards. I must say, though, that I decided to change the title of my presentation a bit. I'm still going to talk about mobile telephony, but perhaps not as directly. So everyone experiences the web differently. Even here in the United States, some people access the web primarily via mobile devices or through their notebooks, and some through their desktop machines. So of course the web is different for differently abled individuals. Blindness, deafness, color blindness, all these things can result in vastly different experiences of the web. This morning, I will argue that the web that Nigerians interact with, or the Nigerian web, is unique in particular ways that are at once profoundly disturbing and also create opportunities for hopeful action. Let me also add 2 points of interest about my talk. First, I study infrastructure, and I'm keenly interested in materiality. For me then, the use of the term web here is interchanged with internet infrastructure. I recognize that for some, the web is just an application that runs on the internet, akin to other apps and services. I'm sorry. Akin to other apps and services like email or messaging. However, I will use the terms interchangeably, though I'm well aware of the important distinction between them. Second, I want to reiterate that Africa as a continent has very different experiences of the internet or web, and those differences are important to pay attention to even within Africa itself. So with that out of the way, is there a truly global web? Well, Alexa seems to think so. So here are the top 10 global websites according to Alexa. 8 of them are based in the United States, and the other 2 are in China. If you can't read that, I apologize. It's Google, Facebook, YouTube, Yahoo, Baidu, Wikipedia, QQ, Twitter, Live.com, and Amazon.com. This is, of course, a very situated and unidimensional definition of the global web, but we have to work with what we have. Let's take a look at Alexa's view of US websites. And Google and Facebook continue their domination, YouTube, Yahoo, Amazon, Wikipedia, LinkedIn, eBay, Twitter, and Craigslist. As one would expect, these sites are all US-based. And the only interesting thing to note here is that Netflix is way down at number 26. And Google and Facebook are both first and second on both the global and US lists. Nevertheless, most of these sites are within the United States. And the servers or server banks that are represented by these sites are also within the United States. So what does the Nigerian web look like according to Alexa? Okay, so I decided I'd go with the top 20. To broaden the picture, here are the top 20 websites that make up the Nigerian web. Google and Facebook continue their domination, but out of the top 20, 7 of them are distinctly Nigerian. By which I mean that they're concerned with issues and matters relating to Nigeria. Nairaland, a foreign website, is number 7, and Vanguard, NGR.com is a newspaper website. Number 13 is a popular culture blog, 14 is another newspaper, 15 is a bank, and 18 and 20 are shopping sites. We should also note that the obsession with soccer or football, as it is known in Nigeria, is clearly reflected in the ranking of Goal.com. A site devoted to football. So the picture is beginning to emerge. While 13 of these sites are US sites, 7 of them are distinctly Nigerian. At least it appears so at first blush. One has to dig a little deeper though. So let's take a closer look at Nairaland and Vanguard on number 7 and 10 respectively. Nairaland.com is a text-based forum website. Topics discussed there range far and wide, and discussions tend to be frank, open, and surprisingly critical. The site is in many ways an unheralded success. Started by a young entrepreneur, Seun Oluwaseun, I think that's his name. It has become amazingly successful and has been very successfully monetized, with advertising sales primarily to the Nigerian market. I was interested, though, in the location of the Nairaland server. Where is the most successful Nigerian website located? So in addition to some other tools, I did a simple trace route from my home in Charlottesville and discovered that the Nairaland forum is hosted here in the United States. Sure, it is run very successfully by a Nigerian software designer and entrepreneur, but he has chosen to locate his site in the US. This means that every time someone in Nigeria accesses Nairaland.com, the packets have to travel halfway around the world, hit a US-based server, and then make the long journey back again. This results in an average latency of about 250 milliseconds on every packet. To put that into perspective, the United Kingdom has an average latency of about 80 milliseconds. So the latency isn't terribly high, but there is a transactional cost to situating the server in the United States. What about the other Nigerian websites? Let's take a look at Vanguard. The story is pretty much the same with Vanguard, Nigeria's premier newspaper website. it also has its server located in the United States. This means that every time one has to access Vanguard's website, the packets will probably travel through one of these submarine cables. And sorry it's so tiny, but I pointed out the two main ports where submarine cables come into the country. So the packets will have to travel through one of these submarine cables or over a satellite connection if one is using that, and then come all the way back again. So I checked all 7 Nigerian websites on the top 20 list. Without exception, all the servers were outside of Nigeria. They were located either in the United States or in Europe. Okay, so now that we know where the servers are, how do Nigerians themselves typically experience their web? So I'm going to turn to another website, statcounter.com. Fascinatingly, Nigeria is one of the very few countries where the web is truly a mobile phenomenon. According to StatCounter, more Nigerians access the web using mobile devices than do using desktop devices. What this means, of course, is that the Nigerian experience of the web is filtered through small screens and tablets and is untethered to specific notions of place. Much like mobile web access everywhere, Nigerians carry their web with them wherever they go. Compare this experience with the United States, where the vast majority of us still experience the web primarily through a large screen. Our webs are still a large screen experience, even though this is changing. And this case in Nigeria holds, even though the cost of mobile data in Nigeria and in the United States is mostly at par. And in some cases, data is actually cheaper in Nigeria than it is in the United States. So this is Etisalat, which is a Sub-Saharan African web provider. And for 15 gig of data, that's about 15,000 naira. And this is a screenshot from AT&T's website. The 15 gig is about $130. So Etisalat, a mobile telephone operator, sells 15 gig of data for roughly about $90, while AT&T sells the same amount for $130. It's true that AT&T will throw in voice and text for that price, but given that Etisalat doesn't require a contract, I think the comparison is a rather apt one. So how can we understand the Nigerian web, and what social, technical, and cultural forces led to the specific contours and shape of this web? I argue that the experience and shape of the Nigerian web cannot be separated from understanding the infrastructural elements of Nigerian life. In a country with an erratic power supply and anemic landline industry, the development of the primarily mobile web makes a lot of sense. Given the huge success of mobile telephony and the transitions we see from voice to data on mobile networks, and the rapidly falling costs of data, a predominantly mobile data-driven experience almost seems inevitable. Also, when you have erratic electrical power, devices that are capable of sporadic reliance on the grid become very sensible choices. So things like mobile telephones and tablets, which can all grab power at night and then you can run with them during the day, make a lot of sense. This dependence on power also goes some way to explaining the reliance on internet servers situated outside the country. But what does this mean for the production and consumption of the web in Nigeria? Let me offer 3 reflections in this material. The first is a negation of Chris Kelty's notion of recursive publics. So if recursive publics are concerned with the material and practical maintenance of the means of their own existence as publics, then the publics that use the Nigerian web are just the opposite of that. The means and practical maintenance of the servers that drive their webs are completely outside of their control. This is not a small matter, as my previous work on mobile networks has shown. Being able to shape the material means of existence is critical to evolving a truly reflexive social technology. The second reflection is an invocation of the critical feminist notion of intersectionality, in the sense that one can only understand the shape of the Nigerian web by understanding the other aberrant infrastructures. The Nigerian web is the vector sum of a messy power infrastructure, poor distribution of electrical power, and a rapidly expanding wireless industry. My third and final reflection addresses the question of why this is important. At both an economic and from a social justice perspective, working out the challenges of developing a truly indigenous web is of paramount importance. Elsewhere in my work, I have shown how the development of mobile telephony and the attendant development of engineering expertise that was necessary to build mobile networks in Nigeria was crucial to the success of mobile telephony networks in that country. A similar case could be made of the development of the movie industry, Nollywood, which is now the second largest in the world in terms of movies produced, second only to Bollywood. In short, destabilizing the center-periphery dynamic of global technology is as much a question of developing creative talent as it is a question of infrastructural interconnectedness. Thank you.
Who is a research fellow at the Berkman Center, and her work focuses on civic engagement online in the Middle East, in addition to different forms of digital storytelling. She's presenting a paper entitled Social Media, Activism, and the Middle East.
Apologies beforehand. Problem with using non-proprietary software, it messes up the all the formatting up there. So bear with me. Let's see if it works. So, okay. As Jillet mentioned, I'm a research fellow at the Berkman Center, and I've been interested for a very long time in the whole concept of online activism and civic engagement. And so I came into the Berkman Center, and the center has been doing a lot of fascinating stuff on that, regarding the network public sphere and focusing on sort of civic engagement online. And of course, the timing is perfect because for the past 3-4 years, everyone has been talking, or a lot of people have been talking about the Arab uprising. So let me backtrack a bit. Back in January of 2011, I was sitting in a library trying to write my master's thesis, and I was actually following the revolutions online. I was following the Tunisian revolution, and as Ben Ali was ousted, I started to get Facebook invitations about January 25th, about Tahrir Square, and actually going out on January 25th. I lived in Egypt for a while and had engaged with a lot of activists there, so I was getting like 5-6 invitations a day. It was fascinating. I have to admit, at the time I didn't expect much, but when I saw what happened on January 25th, it blew my mind. I started, I was in New York, I was nowhere near the Middle East, and I was following the news on sort of Twitter and Facebook and getting all that information before I even saw it on mainstream media. So I knew that, for example, the revolutionaries, the activists needed blood banks, and it was in a specific location in Tahrir Square, and I started actually participating online. I started helping with that information flow on Twitter. And it was interesting. You saw sort of information flows and a lot of organization coordination at the time. Of course, at the time, everyone started talking about this, about the tools, about Facebook and Twitter. I started, being here, I started to go into all these different talks, and everyone was talking about the tools themselves, how they enabled to sort of help organize and coordinate things, and they are the, help democracy happen. And there was a lot of talk about the network public sphere and how people were able to communicate. Just like the Iranian Revolution in 2009, a lot of people said, oh, it was a Twitter revolution. People said it was a Facebook revolution. And a lot of Egyptians actually held, thank you, Facebook. Of course, that's not necessarily the case. And there's been a lot of study about this, a lot of work, and apologies for this, for the formatting. but I'll read something that Zainab actually wrote in a New York Times article not too long ago. Digital tools make it much easier to build up movements quickly, and they greatly lower coordination costs. This seems like a good thing at first, but it often results in an unanticipated weakness. Before the internet, the tedious work of organizing that was required to circumvent censorship or to organize protests also helped build infrastructure for decision-making and strategies for sustaining momentum. Now movements can rush past that step, often to their own detriment. So this is something interesting that sort of captures something about these tools, but also about how activists are starting to think about these tools. We're seeing more and more as people, the team at Berkman alongside me are realizing that activists are changing a lot of their tactics and are starting to realize how to use these tools. And I think we need to, in addition to all the studying, the academic literature that has come out about this issue, is that we need to actually do some more. We need to focus on, do a lot of content analysis, look at the conversations, look at the networks that are being built across the Arab world, and how they're using these tools to sort of spread information, and if they still use it to organize. And this is where sort of the Berkman team comes in, and we're currently working on looking at social network analysis as an initial foundational step to look at how people are communicating with each other, looking at sort of link patterns and structures between different regional players. And so I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. You may have seen different iterations, but back in 2009, the Berkman Center released a map of the Arab blogosphere. And there were some very interesting observations that came out there. This is a 2014 one. This is the most recent iteration. And the map itself works on basic link structure. So we look at how, where the blogs are from and sort of how they link to each other. So you see different clusters where people link heavily to each other. You see more clustering around that, and sort of you see how, basically, I can point for this. Basically here you see a lot of people, this is sort of an Egypt cluster, basically they link strongly to each other. This is more of a Gulf node, and over here, like Palestine, for example, comes, spans across this. So there are very interesting findings that came out of the 2014, and I have to sort of note that these are all initial results and observations, and they're not conclusive. But what was interesting is that most of the clusters, or most of the nodes, were actual country-based nodes. We didn't see a lot of sort of regional cross communication. So Egypt nodes remained, there was a lot of conversation amongst Egypt and focused on Egyptian issues. Same thing with Jordan, same thing with Kuwait. What was very similar to sort of the 2009 blogosphere was that Egypt remained as the most powerful node, or the most popular node. So what we saw is Egypt still has a lot of blogs out there as opposed to other countries. And that's an interesting observation, probably because of the population, massive population they have. I think the most fascinating issue, and I think this is key across the region, and what I've noticed while interacting with activists, is that we're seeing a lot of blogging fatigue, and we're seeing, in a sense, burnout. Now, blogging fatigue, in a sense, means that we're not seeing a lot of active blogs. We see them appear on the map, and it means that they may have changed some things on their blog, but they no longer blog. And so it's interesting to see, or I guess conclude, that the conversation may have shifted elsewhere. People aren't blogging as much as they used to. And it's a good question to ask whether they've moved to Facebook and Twitter, or they've moved to a different platform, or had they stopped completely. And that's something worth sort of researching further. Unlike 2009, unsurprisingly, Palestine was no longer a key issue. So one common theme that existed in 2009 was a lot of the bloggers wrote about Palestine. Come, Arab revolutions, it's no longer the case. Palestine is still an issue, but it's a very, very minor issue. We see a lot of more focus on Egypt, especially with the Egyptian blogs. Some bloggers write about Syria and focus on Syria, so it's become, the focus, the attention has become regional more so on one specific issue. One other thing that we're doing at the Berkman Center is we're looking at Twitter maps. We have a specific set of countries that we're focusing on. Again, this is initial observations and not actual final maps. We're working on iterations, but some of the things, two maps that we've been working on are Palestinians on Twitter, and also Bahrain. And I just wanted to sort of pull this image up because there's some interesting differences in it. And part of it is that one thing that we observed in Palestine is that it's spread out. And what we came out, or one initial observation that came out was that it's actually, the focus is international. Now with the Twitter maps, unlike the blogosphere maps, it's based on followers, on who's following who. And so with Palestine, you get a lot of followers from across the region, but also internationally. So there were some interesting followers from the US, for example. Whereas in Bahrain, it's completely different. And there is a revolution happening in Bahrain. Yes, I'm admitting it on live stream, but there is a revolution happening in Bahrain, but we don't hear much about it. There are people out there protesting. And what's interesting is that we don't get a lot of attention on this, and we don't see that attention on Twitter either, or not as much. And we see a division between sort of the pro-revolution and pro-government, like sort of a split divide. Unlike Palestine, where it's more like universal, we see a definite divide here. Again, this is all initial observations, but this is something that is fascinating, and we're seeing a lot of different links between sort of who's following who and who the powerful players or key players in that region. And again, this is important for us to actually understand where the conversation is happening and how it's happening, or initial foundational basis. Some notes from the ground that are observations. Again, I've talked with a lot of activists, and I engage with them I have to admit, I am from Palestine, and I engage quite actively with the people on the ground. And there's some interesting questions that have emerged in the past few years. And one is like, who's actually really using social media? So who are the people who are actually using Twitter? In Palestine and Egypt, it is rather a small percentage. And it's not a universal thing. So again, to go back to the organization and coordination issue, who are these activists that are trying to coordinate? Are they working on the ground as well? Is this enough, what they're doing? The other thing is that what was interesting from what I've heard from activists and from the maps is that there are communication channels open amongst the region, at least on Twitter. And we're seeing a lot of exchange of information. And there's a lot of information flow and tactics that are being exchanged. Something happens, activists in Palestine use a specific tactic, it gets picked up in Bahrain, it gets picked up in Egypt. And the most key thing is the issue of burnout. We're seeing a lot of burnouts amongst the activists, whether it's on the blogger sphere or other, a lot of activists are fearing for their lives. We're seeing a lot of different tactics, or not as many tactics happening online. Here's a little hypothesis I'm going to leave you with, and sort of thoughts of the future of where this is going in the Arab world and the use of social media. Everyone knows what happened recently, I gather, in Turkey with the Turkish government banning Twitter. I think this is a hypothesis. I think that governments are starting to realize that censorship may not be the way to go. And we're seeing more and more governments using their people on the ground to actually dilute messages on social media. So we see in Egypt, we see pro-military supporters who are actually joining in the conversation. So while social media or Twitter or Facebook may have been platforms for activists or pro-revolutionaries, we're seeing a lot of pro-government supporters who are coming in and diluting that message. So this is, I think, we're going to see a lot less of that and a lot more of people joining the platform. So that sort of drives the question of, will this push for activists to change the platform? What are these platforms that they're going to move into? Is there going to be a complete burnout, or are there going to be cycles of burnout? I think it's worth looking at sort of where the conversations are shifting towards and what new tactics they're going to pick up. And again, like, I yesterday received an email from a friend of mine, an Algerian friend of mine, who had to escape the country because he received death threats. The question there is, when people's lives are at stake, what happens then? And so that's something that I think we should not just look at sort of the platforms themselves, but the human beings behind that. And yeah, thank you.
We saw that with Jason, Dalia, and David's presentations. I was also very happy that our presenters could touch upon digital divides, particularly to look at what are the different types of infrastructures out there and how do people use them. And we particularly have to thank David and Tolu for touching upon that. And I also like that one of the questions that came up in different ways was, who are the different people who are using or accessing the new media in different parts of the world? And I think there's quite a bit of variation there, and I'm glad that you touched upon that. And that sort of brings us also to look at what are the different practices then, you know, who is engaged in accessing the new media, and how is it that they in different ways access the media, to what ends? So with that brief comment, I think I'd like to throw the session out to questions from you. So.
I have a question for Baike. I was interested in the hypothesis that you had at the end of your talk, where you said that it's possible maybe that some of these governments are restrictive governments are maybe moving away from censorship and more toward a more proactive way of diluting the data stream. And that's essentially engaging more in propaganda than in two sides of the same coin. I'm wondering why you think that is. Do you think it's because the censorship is becoming less practical and it's no longer as effective, or is it from an international public relations sort of standpoint that they're afraid to be engaging in these sorts of activities?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is just a hypothesis. It may not, you know, they may still use censorship techniques, and they do, by arresting bloggers or threatening their lives. That's a different form of censorship, but it still exists. But I think you touched upon the two key issues, is that one is a lot of activists are using different techniques and tools to circumvent censorship, and that was key in, for example, Tunisia, where YouTube was banned, and yet they still found a way to actually watch these videos throughout the country. The other issue is that, yeah, it's internationally, when your country is put on like a list of, you know, censorship, the Freedom House,
enemies of the internet.
Enemies of the internet, then that is a horrible PR issue. And when you're a military government or an authoritarian regime that's being pressured by various international players, you kind of want to play that international like propaganda PR game. So I think it's a bit of both. And again, like when activists, whether they use hashtags, you know, on Twitter to trend and push for attention on a certain cause, if you have a different player that's trying to dilute that message, then in some sense the activists may fail in pushing their message forward. Yeah. So it's also diluting the message as well, and it's playing that game.
I have a question about the Nigerian web. I was wondering if you had any sort of breakdown on who was using the web with regard to language, socioeconomic levels, and if those variables change anything about which sites are popular and what people are doing online.
That's a great question. And I have to acknowledge that I don't have the breakdowns, but I do think if we look at, because it's so bound up with another infrastructure, which is the mobile telephony network, if you look at who uses mobile telephony and how much money they're spending on data, then I think one would have to say it's still predominantly middle-class Nigerians. Nevertheless, one is always very surprised when you look, when I'm talking to the mobile telephony networks and talking to people who run them, it appears that the vast majority of their users use data services. So this isn't just limited to a small section. And because data these days is turned on by default in most of these mobile networks, it becomes rather easy for people to start, especially with Facebook, which you just run the app on your device, and it's it's a low bandwidth sort of connection there. Sorry, I don't have any more detailed information.
To a question, what's the percentage of smartphone usage there?
Smartphones versus dumb phones or feature phones? I think it's very rapidly changing, and if I remember correctly, David was talking about the shift towards Chinese-based smartphone devices. So I mean, the Android devices these days are roughly $7,000, so $50.
That's what we mean by smartphone when we say smartphone, because something that can hook to the internet is not what we would consider a smartphone, but it still can do everything that a smartphone can do.
I actually wanted to kind of piggyback off of that. Do you observe a difference between urban and rural usage? I'm just wondering if you've observed that.
In terms of mobile telephony or in terms of the web access?
Web access or mobile telephony?
So I don't have the breakdowns between urban and rural, but I think, of course, it's going to be predisposed towards the urban environment, but I wouldn't rule out rural use of the web. So there's a great book by Heather Horst and Daniel Miller called The Cell Phone that talks about mobile telephony use in Jamaica. And one of the arguments they make is that even people in rural areas use their devices to sort of link up. They have this theory of link up where you make calls or you keep contacts alive because you get resources through those contacts. And I have seen very similar things in rural environments in Nigeria where people use their devices either through text messaging or Facebook to keep contacts alive because those contacts are the ways through which they gain resources to conduct their lives.
Yeah, can I piggyback on that? And then I wanted to ask you guys a question on it, so one of the things I saw when I was in Rwanda is people talking about that there's a very big difference between how people use cell phones and mobile phones and these sort of smartphones in, say, Kigali versus how they would use it in the rural areas, is that they're all using it. Let's say the guy in the more rural areas is going to be checking the weather because he's more interested to know how that's going to affect his agriculture versus some of the more privileged people in Kigali are checking it to tweet to their friends, which was something that I was thinking about during both of your guys' presentations and really wondering, especially with regard to activism, which is like, what is the role of privilege in all of this in terms of like web activism, web participation, web censorship? Because for me, that's like the sort of, and I see it a lot, there's like on Twitter, there's the Twitterati of Lagos, of Nigeria, and they're so strong, but they're all middle class, and they're all upper middle class, and how does that relate and change the discourse, and what does that affect on it? So I didn't know if you guys have like, because also like privilege of editing, or having that ability to edit, so I didn't know if you guys were thinking about that in your work, or what, I don't know. This is just a general question.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something that comes up quite often with regards to Chinese usage of Twitter or versus, which is the more popular microblog service that I particularly focus on, which is Weibo.
Yeah.
And so there's, it's hard, I don't want to generalize, but essentially there's sort of two camps for thinking about internet activism in China. You can either go to Weibo and speak to the masses and trying to work within the system and trying to reach out to folks who are engaged within the Chinese system, or you could go outside, go use Twitter, go escape the Great Firewall, and engage with folks who are maybe more sophisticated, who you can actually engage maybe in a higher level discussion or that sort of thing, and you can enact change from the outside. So it's a matter of thinking about what the most effective strategy is, and I think both tactics have value. It's just a matter of trying to understand what campaign you're trying to run and then choosing the service appropriately.
I think at this point we should quickly ask the hash mod if she has some questions.
So there was just one question for you, Jason. How do you do your research? Do you use like API or like API, or do you use scrub pages?
Yeah, in this case, I just scrape pages manually. In past cases, I've used API stuff, but oftentimes there's rate limiting. So in this case, I just scrape them straight up. But again, it's some of these Chinese websites, it's very slow to run sometimes. They load very slowly because of load and the fact that I'm based here in the US. But yeah, that's what I do.
Can I follow up? Are you planning on open sourcing any of those tools? Like what? Or are they kind of like hacky?
I've definitely thought about whether or not to open source like these sorts of scraping mechanisms, scraping like tools, and like I've gone back and forth. The thing that pushes me away from doing this sort of thing is because technically what I'm doing is against the terms of services for a lot of these sites. So I'm hesitant to really make it public. But certainly, if folks are interested, feel free to contact me privately and we could discuss.
Yes. Yeah, along the same technical lines for Dolly, I was wondering what you use to do visualizations. Are those like an R? Are there packages elsewhere that you're using?
Yeah, we're working with Morningside Analytics. It's a tech startup based here, actually in New York, and they come up with all these visualizations. But how we did it was we started off with a basic seed set of both blogs and also for Twitter, specifically Twitter handles, and it sort of builds the map from there. But it's all Morningside Analytics.
I have a question for Dolly and Jason. When you talk about pro-government supporters diluting the conversation, I know in China there's the sort of 50-cent party where it seemed like the government was actually paying people to change the dialogue. How do you think that's happening, and how obvious is it? Is it people masquerading as regular citizens, or is it more direct involvement?
So I can give you one example that happened in Palestine last summer. There were a group of protesters, a very small group of protesters, who were trying to march towards the president's office in Ramallah, and the Palestinian police stopped them. And there were some videos that came out, both of the protesters screaming profanities at the soldiers, at the police. We don't have a military, but it's at the police, and the police striking back or pushing some of the protesters. Now, these videos could have gone either way, or the message could have gone either way, and it's happened in the past where protesters have used these videos and images and talked about police brutality. In this case, what happened is the pro-Fatah supporters, and these are supporters of the current government, Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas, the president. They're regular people. I believe they're regular citizens. I obviously need to do more research on that, but they shifted the conversation and talked about the protesters who were yelling profanities at the police. And so in that case, it was no longer, we're trying to protest this thing and this is police brutality. It switched to, oh, these protesters are yelling profanities, it's their fault. So. Yeah.
Oh, and as for the China example, I think it's important to keep in mind that certainly, especially, I guess the origins of the 50-cent party at the time was actually came out of, I think, one of the southern universities, maybe like Nanjing or Shenzhen or somewhere like that, but where actually people were paid to post pro-government messages on these university message boards. But since then, it's more evolved, and the term sort of encapsulates a larger set of people who just maybe aren't paid, and maybe they're not voluntary members of some government organization, but it's just folks who are generally patriotic and nationalistic, or not even nationalistic. They just believe in their government, which I think most folks, for the most part, well, maybe not here in the US, but I think countries generally, you want to believe that your leaders are doing the right thing. And in China, I think certainly, if you look at the polling numbers, especially if you look at these broad-based surveys where they ask people, do you love your country? Do you believe in your government? Do you have trust and faith in your national government? For the most part, the numbers are astronomically high. They're like in the 80, 90%. So it's important to keep in mind that a lot of folks, are just adding their genuine thoughts in the conversation. It's not necessarily propaganda.
I actually have two questions that are totally separate. But so my question for David is, your analysis was really great, and I think it would be like, familiar and well received among academic or critical circles. But I wonder, as someone who works in that industry, how much does it resonate with people you work with? Are people sort of like, yeah, let's bring Gramsci into this, or what are you talking about? And then so I'll just say my question for Dahlia too. I was wondering, I really think it's great that you're talking about burnout, because I think that is important in two senses. And so I'm wondering, is it burnout among activists, they're burnt out on activism, or is it burnout on the platforms? Are they burnt out on blogging, or on the posting, or is it a mix? So.
Okay, so I guess I think I give you the classic consultant answer, which is like, it depends. I don't know. I think that I'm very lucky because I work for a company that is very political and very open with our politics. We're very left-wing, so the company I work for is a company called ThoughtWorks, and we have, as one of our 3 pillars, is a commitment to social justice. And so within that, like our founder is also a communist, and we talk about Gramsci over dinner. So that's great. But at the same time, like, talking to different people about it, I think it really depends. Like they'll say, what is, when we talk about privilege, I think, then you have to really break it down. And when we're talking about it with them, is it cultural, is it financial, and trying to get it away from the sort of high level talking about it? Because I think it can, when we start those conversations, it can put people off, and I think it can confuse them. So definitely, like within the wider community, there's some kind of like, why we're past that. We're like so post-racial, and you're kind of like, oh gosh. Anyways, so yeah, it really depends. Maybe we can talk about it more after.
So I think what we're seeing is burnout on both senses. So we're seeing some burnout in terms of activism as a whole, especially when you see a revolution starting, elections, and then like just a cycle of violence after violence, and not entirely a democratic process. And so there is definitely a cycle of burnout there, but there's also a burnout about the platform, because if we're seeing a lot of diluting of the message, but also seeing that, for example, hashtag trends don't necessarily mean that the news or the story will get picked up all the time, or it doesn't really create change. So I think there's this now disillusionment around the platforms themselves and what they can do, but also in terms of how things are progressing on the ground. But I think it also, there is burnout, but it also, I think, goes around in cycles. And so we see burnout for a period of time, and then somehow regrouping, or a different set of activists that emerge as well.
And I think that's about all of the time that we have for today in terms of a formal conversation. Of course, feel free to engage and continue the conversation after the session. Thank you very much, Presider.
Yeah, great stuff.
Yeah.